Hi, welcome to Read Capitalism. This is Josh. This is part 2 of our conversation with Jason Moore, a historical geographer at Binghamton University. In this discussion, we delve into the concept of substance fetishism within Marxian social theory, the danger it poses, and its implications for understanding the web of life. Moore raises concerns about the misguided focus on substance fetishism, which prioritizes the management of substances over the revolutionizing of labor relations. The conversation also touches on the historical and contemporary implications of this perspective, including its impact on understanding energy histories, class formation, and imperialism. He critiques the narrow focus of some environmental and Marxist scholars, advocating for a more integrated approach that considers the socioecological dynamics of labor and class struggle. We also discuss the role of intellectuals and the limitations of academic discourse in addressing these antagonisms. Our conversation concludes with reflections on the potential of revolutionary change and the importance of historical materialism in understanding and addressing this current ecological and social crises. As always, if you like what we do, support our ability to have more conversations like this, please consider becoming a patron. You can do so for as little as $1 a month. We bring you these conversations totally independently with no corporate, state, or grant funding. We're going to include a set of links in the show notes to Dr. Moore's articles we are referencing throughout our conversation. Please check those out for further information. Now, here's Jason Moore discussing some of his work.
So I would like to, going off of what you said about Federici, I would like to ask you about a somewhat crude tendency that you describe as substance fetishism, and this approach that some people, I guess, mistake for what genuine historical materialism can look like. And I was thinking about this actually because Federici's intellectual trajectory actually replicates that with her later work Beyond the Periphery of the Skin, making, in my opinion, a kind of crude substance fetishist approach that ends up peddling transphobia into her career effectively. And while I'm not saying that your detractors, including some thinkers who focus entirely on energy and nothing else to understand the climate crisis, or even some more crude workerists who focus on only a very specific understanding of industrial worker and class and specific forms of working class struggle. I'm not going to name names, although we can figure out probably who this is referring to. I view this as a similar misguided focus. So I guess I want to ask you to clarify what you mean by substance fetishism first, and what dangers this kind of substance fetishism poses in Marxian social theory. And I guess going off of that, how do you understand multiple forms of class struggle in the web of life?
Any questions? So substance fetishism is the belief that elements of the web of life, resources, soils, even the atmosphere, human populations have in the scholarly way of putting it, have an ontological existence prior to labor relations. Now, this does not mean that the Earth doesn't orbit around the sun. It doesn't mean that volcanoes don't erupt, whether there's capitalism, feudalism, socialism, whatever. It means that we, in the tradition of historical materialism, that we understand substances as the outcome of relations. One of the benchmarks, the hallmarks of modern thought coming out of the Cartesian revolution of the 16th and 17th century is the prioritization of substances over relations. This is fundamental to managerial views of the web of life. And for those who are curious, like, why are you talking about Descartes? Descartes simply stands in for a much broader, not just a scientific revolution, but essentially a managerial revolution that is alive and well, not just the management of the workplace and the factory, but the management of war and power, questions that Foucault has raised, but in very obscurantist ways, and the management of planetary life, which has been ongoing in various forms really since the long, cold 17th century. So substance fetishism is so dangerous because it directs our attention to the management of substances rather than the revolutionizing of labor relations. And that doesn't mean we ignore fossil fuels. But when we give fossil fuels, for instance, and this is Andreas Malm's theory of capital, which is a very, very revisionist, anti-Marxist approach, because he drops in coal as within Marx's circuit of capital. And even though Marx has a category, the circulating moment of constant capital, that captures what coal and energy does precisely, what they are doing is stoking a neo-Malthusian or left Malthusian politics that finds expression today, for instance, in blowing up pipelines, stop oil, and et cetera. And that's a very, very dangerous kind of politics, because it directs our attention to the substances rather than the relations of capitalist power. And there are other issues with that, but this comes up again and again and again. The alternative is, as Marx does, to show that, yes, the transformation of coal as a rock in the ground into fossil fuel is a socio-ecological class dynamic of the highest order. And that there is, and Marx gives it a central place in his theory of the falling rate of profit. This is his general law of underproduction. He unpacks this in Capital Volume 3. I've cited it and tried to articulate a theory of it in some detail over the past decade. Marxist political economists almost universally ignore it. And that's a shame, because it gives us a way to put together the relations of the earth, the relations of life, class relations, capital relations in a rich totality of many determinations, as Marx liked to say. But if we go deeper into the history of thought and the creation of real abstractions, as Sohn-Redl says, or ruling abstractions, as I say, before there could be commodity fetishism, there had to be two other kinds of fetishism. One was substance fetishism. The other was civilizational fetishism. And in fact, they go hand in glove, historically speaking. This sounds philosophical, but this is in fact very, very concrete and historical. That the emergence of a civilizing project with the thinking essences, as Descartes said, and the savages as extended, was to create, in effect, two substances. The enlightened substance of civilized man and the malleable, sort of dumb, stupid, inert, passive substances of humans and the rest of nature. So what most eco-socialists and most environmentalists don't want to acknowledge is that in the invention of man and nature, and thank you also, Josh, for bringing that up so many times, that it's really crucial to recognize that most human beings in the 16th, 17th, 18th century were not part of the category of man, of humanity. They were part of the category of nature. That's why various movements in the 20th century said we're civil rights movements, because they were marking their expulsion from civilization. And once we start to look at it in this very concrete historical way, I know the language is abstract, but all of what I'm saying has a deep and rich and complex history that's totally empirical. Once we start to look at it, we really start to see the violence of an idea like the Anthropocene. And the Anthropocene, their stock and trade are several substances. One of them is, of course, human population, which is there as much as ever. And then these substances, these greenhouse gases. And what is the political project of the Anthropocene? Well, to manage the biosphere in the interests of class society, capitalism, or some post-capitalist society. So this question of substance fetishism is very, very crucial. I have a very, very different reading of what Marx is doing, and I think it's very useful for this discussion. Marx and Engels were critics of abstract man. In fact, historical materialism as a way of thinking emerges out of their critique of somebody called Feuerbach and the idea that man in general is the starting point, abstract man. In the Communist Manifesto, they denounce these illusions of man in general. And they also denounce the abstractly material character of science, of bourgeois science, and its relation to nature as one-sided, as abstract. So what is it that we should be looking at, if not the collision of man and nature? Well, Marx and Engels have a great answer. It's labor. And Engels, in that famous essay, The Transition from Ape to Man, the role of labor in the transition from ape to man, says simply labor created man. Now, he doesn't mean that in some naive way, but he means that the labor process itself is fundamental to the evolutionary process of the human, of pre-modern humans evolving, and the landscape transformations that they engaged in. This is a line of thought taken up and pursued by Richard Levins and Richard Lewontin, who are celebrated by eco-socialists like in Monthly Review. It seems to me that those Monthly Review people have never taken Levins and Lewontin seriously, or they would not publish collections of essays like Marx in the Anthropocene and Capitalism, Capital in the Anthropocene, Marx in the Anthropocene, all of these in the Anthropocene titles. I understand that when you have sort of critical intellectuals who are generally anti-working class doing it, but when you have Marxists who are embracing the Anthropocene, that's a sign of a deep ideological rot and basically a refusal to take seriously Marx's labor ontology, what I've called the labor theory of life. And that's a direct antidote to this substance fetishism.
I guess I'd like you to go on a little bit more about how to then situate energy histories, and specifically like the departure point from what McNeill, even though obviously not Marxist, but I guess what McNeill calls the Great Acceleration. So I guess how do we situate straightforward understandings of energy history within their broader umbrellas of understanding processes of racialization, gender, and also various forms of class formation and accumulation on a world scale?
Outstanding. Yes. And all of those issues you just flagged are precisely what is ruled out by the neo-Malthusian formulation of the Great Acceleration, which is kind of centrist, neoliberal, environmental history reckoning of what we used to call the golden age of capitalism. That is, after World War II, the U.S. sets about reorganizing and saving global capitalism, encircling the Soviet Union, engaging in an unprecedented wave of counterinsurgency and regime change politics across the newly independent global South. And all of those issues that I just flagged, all of those issues, Casey, that you just flagged, are completely ruled out by these references to the Great Acceleration. It is a class, I think this is why you're asking it as a follow-up, it's a classic case of substance fetishism. Probably many listeners are familiar with the J-stick curves, not just in relation to climate and greenhouse gases, but all of the so-called trajectories of the Anthropocene, of urbanization, of resource use, of energy use, as you're saying. And of course, what we're seeing is the profound disconnection and fragmenting of the energy history from, as you nicely introduced into our conversation, Casey, the questions of world class formation, of class struggle. Basically, the storyline, in my view, if we're looking at energy, world power, class dynamics after World War II, is the peculiar situation in which the American empire found itself. In the history of great world hegemonic powers, the Dutch and British before the Americans, the masters of the world had ruled through, by and large, colonial empire. The fruition of the American struggle against the European and then Japanese empires was premised on the destruction of that old European system of formal colonial rule. This was the Wilsonian project coming out of World War II. Let's destroy the old formal empires, because then the United States can and American capitalism will figure out a way to make the most of it. And indeed, within capitalist terms, they did make the most of it. So the Americans faced a very peculiar situation that they had to figure out how to organize a drastically unequal world without formal empire. And so that sets the story, that sets the stage for these narratives of the Cultural Cold War in Western Europe, of the Green Revolution in South and Southeast Asia, of Big D development. It's through this project that Truman's speechwriters, because Truman was dumb as a post, but Truman's speechwriters write the famous Point 4 inaugural address statement in 1949, which declares most of the world is undeveloped and will help you, you savages, now called undeveloped, will help you modernize if only you go along with our program, which means don't mess around with the Soviets. Now, what were the Soviets doing? Why were the Soviets such a problem? And it wasn't because they were communist, whatever that means. It wasn't because they were socialist, whatever that means. Two big problems the Soviets posed. One of them was they couldn't be pushed around because they had their own resources, so they couldn't be starved of energy. And they had a political and military capacity to defend themselves. The other point is that the Soviets were part of the first great wave of national liberation movements in the 20th century, along with Mexico, of course. And the Soviets posed a model of kind of independent nationalist development. And this had great appeal across the global South, as you can imagine. To make matters worse, the Americans also seemed to support a model of independent nationalist development. So the danger was that you would have bourgeois democratic states across the global South take the American line seriously of development. Well, we're going to develop. We need nationalism, so we're going to do our best to consume the energy and other resources that would otherwise for our own development. And if we pause for a moment to think of some of the most significant regime change operations in the post-war era, there's stories like Mossadegh in 1953, of course, the democratically elected prime minister of Iran. There's Sukarno in Indonesia in 1965. And of course, we can multiply that many times over. Arbenz in Guatemala, not because it was a resource-rich country, but because they wanted to follow the American family farm national development model. Allende's Chile, countless other instances. So that this is the story of how the history of energy, contrary to the neo-Malthusian and neoliberal presentation of John McNeill and his co-author Engelke in the book, The Great Acceleration. In contrast to them, we show that world nature, world power, world capital were always just entwined, but interpenetrating. And again, one of these rich totalities that Marx speaks of. That's the power of the Marxist imagination. And I'm very concerned when we have all of these deviations from that without really taking seriously the politics of substance fetishism. So we now have calls for kind of ultra-left version of the old Earth First strategy. Let's blow up pipelines. Earth First said, well, let's go drive nails into trees that are slated to be cut down, endangering the lives of mill workers. There's a lot, the problem is fossil fuels. Stop fossil fuels. The problem is not fossil fuels. The problem is capital. And the problem is how the energy is mobilized, as you're suggesting, Casey, in relation to labor and in relation to world power.
Going off your point on, I guess, class formation following the Great Acceleration, I'd also like to ask about another phenomenon that's occurring at the same time, and I believe, and many other thinkers definitely believe this, that it's incredibly intertwined, which is the phenomenon of global depeasantization and global land grabs across following 1945 to the present moment. And the phrase global depeasantization comes from Farshad Raghi. And this phenomenon occurs across the world in prominently India, the Philippines, Mexico in the 1990s, and the Horn of Africa as prominent examples in the 20th century. So I guess what's the connection between the global agrarian question with these energy transitions and forms of accumulation in the web of life? And
the depeasantization is the normal state of historical capitalism. It's never total. the normal condition of the world proletariat is a semi-proletariat. Why? Because fully proletarianized laborers are extremely expensive to reproduce. That's why historically the number of full working lifetime wage workers has been very low and is very low today. I think of somebody like the great geographer Melissa Wright talking about disposable workers, the third world woman workers, the pillar of neoliberal capitalism. And that story, of course, is one of those workers being used up and then sent back home to reproduce outside the formal wage relation new workers. So this is a story of proletarianization. And it's also a question of, to some degree, cash crop expansion and neoliberal reforms, but also of warfare across this period. You mentioned the Horn of Africa and places like that, Afghanistan, etc. So that's there's been an explosion of peasants or semi-peasants. And I'll get to that in just a moment, from the countryside into the cities, leading to the phenomenon of what Mike Davis, rest in power, comrade, called surplus humanity. That is, workers above and beyond even the needs for a reserve army of labor. That these are workers who are nevertheless nearly totally ostracized from any formal relations of work. And that explains the peculiar dynamics of third world urbanization in the post-war neoliberal periods. But this is basically a story of proletarianization. And I'm not sure if Farshad, Farshad Araghi is brilliant. If you haven't read him, he's useful to read. He's really captured within the moment of sort of Polanyian liberal globalization studies, where he couldn't talk about class and class formation, but that's exactly what he's talking about. And I think he would agree. So that's a dynamic that is now with us, but there is, and this is also part of Mike Davis's thesis, which he didn't ever really unpack even as adequately as we might wish. But that's where I'm coming in to say it's the crisis formation moments of the surplus humanity come through the utter exhaustion of capitalism's productive capacities. And that's the era of zombie capitalism. It's the era of the end of agricultural revolution, the end of industrial revolution, these great leaps forward in labor productivity, et cetera, et cetera. But the other thing that these waves of depeasantization achieved was the end of the classical peasant. Yes, there are still people who work the land, but by and large, when we're looking at agrarian zones for most of the world, outside the highly capitalized rich countries, we are looking at agrarian formations characterized by what Henry Bernstein calls agrarian classes of labor. And that's important because one of the strains of left agrarian capitalism, and there are versions of this in the kind of woke clash of civilizations argument, is that our political struggles should center around land. Now, land is very important, but our political struggles should center around class politics, class power. And to the degree that means land seizures and occupations and redistributions, great. But land does not have a special ontological category. And there's a real danger in going down that rabbit hole, which is a substance fetishist rabbit hole. We should, as revolutionaries, look for the possibilities to transcend capitalism's class relations and, as Marx reminds us, expropriate the expropriators.
If you first wouldn't mind, could you expand more in your critique of exclusively focusing on land as a avenue of struggle?
Well, I think that, to reiterate the earlier point, we need to look at the relations of class power. And of course, we're living a moment where the Gates Foundation is the largest owner of farmland in North America. There's no question that a socialist politics appropriate to the climate crisis will involve a conscious democratization of access to land, support for agroecological techniques, support for cooperative moments of farming, and to break with, I think, not just bourgeois notions of capitalist farming, but also a lot of petty bourgeois notions that, well, let's go back to the land and we can have a society of independent small producers. Sometimes, maybe yes. I think it depends a lot on what kind of agriculture, where it is in the world, where it is in proximity to major cities, and what crop mixes we're looking at, because the crop mixes and the labor relations are also intimately tied. In other words, we need to resist the temptation to see the crisis as one of land. Like, if only we give the land back, then that will solve the problem. Sometimes it leads to quite naive maximalist positions, like as we see in the Palestinian solidarity movements, from the river to the sea. And, somehow the fantasy is that a nuclear state is going to just say, oh, we were wrong all along. So land is part of the political dynamics. I don't want anyone to think, oh, Moore just dismisses land. No, land is huge. It's a fundamental moment of the struggle. There's also a tendency, however, to devolve into an agrarian populism that then doesn't adequately build out the city-country, land-labor relations that will be necessary to deal with a climate-ravaged world moving forward.
Thank you for that answer. That actually segues into a question that I was thinking about asking about imperialism specifically and how you conceptualize it. I'd like if you could talk about imperialism and ecology and surplus populations at large and how it actually could be applied to the current moment around global conflicts and particularly Palestine. And I found in my engagement with your work, it's very good at situating the colonization of obviously the Atlantic and the Americas as your examples, and studying Zionist colonialism of Palestine, specifically the lead up before 1948, which took place under the auspices of some developmentalist claims, as well as making appeals to imperialist conservation practices as well. But as you touched on earlier, modern imperialism does not seek to make developmentalist claims. And the current genocide and war against life sustainability is clearly not that. There are no proposed aspirations to transform the land or surplus populations, quote unquote, into any framework of offsetting crises of overaccumulation or underproduction, which some theorists of imperialism or some figures who seek to dismiss the category of imperialism argue. And similar scenes can be seen.
Good luck with that.
Similar obviously can be understood in similar dynamics can be understood in recent wars in Afghanistan, as you noticed, or financialized forms of energetic capital expansion led by the Gulf Cooperation Council, where de-development characterizes these projects in their frontiers in Egypt, Yemen, Sudan, and Somalia. So I guess in your framework of frontiers of cheap natures and frontiers of expropriation, what's the relationship between ongoing de-development as a driving factor of modern imperialism and that?
And tell me more. What do you mean by de-development? I mean, I'm familiar generally with people throwing around the term, but it's not always so clear.
That's fair. When I'm discussing de-development, I'm more focusing on the dynamics of, say, deindustrialization or reductions in certain productivity levels that facilitate, say, the flows of certain commodities that end up disrupting local production sites. I'm thinking primarily the export of U.S. grain, which ends up flooding peripheral markets as an example concerning agriculture.
Okay. Well, that makes sense. I'm not sure the value added of this is not a comment on you using it, but of why people would use de-development, since that's just the normal state of imperialism. And I was thinking, is this not the outcome of the Washington Consensus in Africa and Latin America, both of which experienced so-called lost decades of development, where per capita economic growth was static throughout the 80s into the early 90s as a result of the debt regime and the new face of imperialism. By the way, I think that the key lessons from that imperialist form of degrowth, and that's not a knock on socialist degrowthers, but that's an imperialist form of degrowth. And the folks in that sort of Brussels, Davos, Pentagon, White House, Wall Street nexus are well aware of that history and what they were able to do in that period. Of course, they didn't have to deal with China and Belt and Road, which is providing a counterweight and some room for maneuver in places like Africa. I think when it comes to imperialism, which is clearly still in play, and I don't know why serious people would say this is not still in play. For me, it's of course we need theory, and Lenin reminded us we need to engage in the theoretical struggle, which is part of the revolutionary practical tasks of the political struggle. But clearly what we're seeing are new faces of the classic Luxembourg model of imperialism. The imperialist centers exploit the colonies, but also an intensification of the Leninist moment of the intensification of inter-imperialist rivalry. Of course, this is its epicenter is in Ukraine with the face-off between NATO and unofficially, of course, NATO and Belt and Road. That's a war over Belt and Road. It's an instance of what Lenin called wars of redivision. Now, at the end of capitalism, we know it's the end because the sources of cheap nature are no longer sufficient to overcome the long-term collapse in labor productivity, the long-term collapse, long-term, I mean over the past 20, 25 years, collapse in labor productivity, collapse in investment, collapse in agricultural productivity growth that are all consequent on the exhaustion of cheap natures, and not only in the sense of cheap labor, food, energy, and raw materials, those four cheaps, but also Josh mentioned Kadri's comments on waste, but also in terms of the exhaustion of the waste frontier. And waste frontiers have always implied laying waste to people and places. That these two dynamics, the overflowing of the waste frontier, particularly in the climate crisis, its costs are now being felt in the core relations of capitalism, combined with the exhaustion of the four cheaps, is producing a situation of zero-sum conflicts around the world. Like, why didn't the U.S. allow Ukrainians to accept what would have been a very generous peace deal from Russia in March of 2022, scuttling that peace agreement, sending Boris Johnson, of all people, to Kyiv to scuttle that agreement? Why is that? Well, it's because that of the zero-sum character of geopolitical power and profit at this precise moment. So I think maybe we're seeing a version of that with very, very different specifics that Casey, you can talk about with much greater knowledge than I can. But a similar version of this in Israel, where it just becomes a zero-sum conflict. In 1950s, 60s Israel, the Palestinian working class was still necessary. Now they've been rendered surplus to requirements. Again, this is always this sort of complex dynamic of class, nation, and nature, and the formation of what the Salvage Collective nicely calls the natural security state. And that's really that's a way of talking about the resurgence of blood and soil nationalism from the right as well as the left, and forms of biosecurity and naturalist sort of the militarization of climate, but also the drive to imperialist war, the ramping up of war machines in places like Germany to fight a large-scale continental war at this moment of what they call the Great Implosion. So I say capitalism is in its zombie phase. Its inner sources of vitality are gone. So it feasts on the brains of the living, if you will. It's moving about, it's deadly, but inside it's totally dead. And that's the point of Gramsci's morbid symptoms. That's what we're seeing in Ukraine, where the sort of liberal, in a political science term, but the neocons have ruled the day and think, well, we're just going to fight until the last Ukrainian, because this is a sign of the U.S. moving towards a political mode of accumulation, or a geopolitical mode of accumulation, as opposed to something that might resemble a more rational imperialist strategy. The short answer is imperialism is always about the web of life. And somehow folks have pretended that's not so. But if we look at a lot of the great Marxist interventions around imperialism, there's a huge amount of attention to the political economy of labor and resources in there.
Actually, that last point takes us to our next point, because I would love for you to discuss a bit your conceptualization of the web of life thesis, its relation to the class struggle. But first, I would like to read one of my favorite passages from all the articles I've read of yours, in which you can feel free to elaborate on or say a few things about. You write that, and I'm quoting here, this is a necessary insight as we envision a socialist reconstruction in the wake of capitalogenic ecocide. Cooperation is a productive force as a source of wealth, and as historical man's inorganic body, extra-human webs of life are internal to the proletarian struggle to delineate the relations of the soil and the worker. Put simply, the class struggle is a multi-species affair through which the soil and the worker interpenetrate. Proletarian emancipation and biotarian liberation are two moments in the journey towards the communist horizon. This is not for some warm and fuzzy ecocentric reason. No, indeed. The socialist development of the productive forces can only be realized through such cooperation. Extra-human life is not outside but imminent to the cooperative potentialities that may be awakened by the revolutionary struggles of the associated producers and reproducers. The praxis of biotarian and proletarian unity would advance a red Promethianism, not as a bourgeois logic of a domination, but as a spark of a really revolutionary road, one that develops the productive forces through the liberation of life. The creatures too must become free, end quote.
So that's from my essay, Opiates of the Environmentalists. And one of the major opiates to the environmentalism of the environmentalists is nature. Marx was always arguing against this. And it's surprising to me that we see leading ecological Marxists pretend that in many ways, the first and primary object of Marx's critique was nature and naturalism. This is not some obscure point in Marxist thinking. Much of what you just read was my thinking that came out of reading the German ideology, where Marx and Engels talk very directly about cooperation as a material force. But also, of course, the critique of nature and naturalism is evident in Marx's critique of Malthus. That seems like the most obvious thing in the world, that Marx's historical materialism is a critique of naturalism and of nature as a ruling idea, or what I would call a ruling abstraction. So that for Marx, labor is irreducibly socioecological. Marx insists, not once, not twice, many times across his corpus, that labor is I quote from the Grundrisse, a specifically harnessed natural force, that as labor changes what he calls variously the rest of nature or external nature, as labor acts upon external nature, labor itself is changed, labor relations are changed. It is a process of reinvention, of course, within definite relations of what Marx and Engels call the modes of life. And modes of life don't go away with modes of production. They're enfolded into modes of production. Marxists don't talk about these things, which is very curious. In the passage that you read where I quote cooperation, or I draw on cooperation as a productive force, this is also where Marx and Engels insist in the German ideology that production is about both the production of one's daily bread, but also of the creation of fresh life and procreation. It's a dynamic of production and reproduction. It is social and natural at the same time. That's the language that they use. And it is, in other words, a perspective of the class struggle in the web of life. I point this out about the soil and the worker. Many people who have now been exposed to some version of Marx and ecology are familiar with Marx's concluding words at the end of the chapter on large-scale industry, where he points out that capitalism, large-scale industry, exhausts the soil and the worker. Soil and the worker is his favorite phase. Now, he's not saying the soil over here in one category and the worker over here in another category. He's saying, no, soil and the worker are dialectically co-constituted. They're dialectically joined, which means a socialist project of reconstruction. Maybe this speaks to your point about land, Casey. The socialist project of reconstruction is one of the class struggle on the land, in the land, with the soil, with the plants, with the birds and the bees. We want, indeed, that many-sided liberation that Marx and Engels famously mentioned, where we write poetry in the morning and we can go hunt at night and we can make love in the afternoon, all those wonderful things that will come with the triumph of the proletarian forces. So there's the reimagining of what I call proletariat, femitariat, and biotariat, not as separate categories, but as separate moments of the proletarian condition. So femitariat doesn't mean women workers. Biotariat doesn't mean the bacteria in soils. And it means we're looking at rich totalities of many determinations. And the point about cooperation, I think, has maybe been marginalized in some of these recent discussions that are characterized maybe as left eco-modernization theory. And I think sometimes there's a caricature of these approaches that I think is unfair. It seems to me that people like Matt Huber have some good things to say and shouldn't be dismissed. However, I'm not going to dismiss him. I'm simply going to say that the forces of production are not only about new machinery. They're also about cooperation. And in that light, we should go back and look at the history of socialist reconstruction. I know we're supposed to say the Soviets and the Chinese and everyone else who ever tried to build socialism were terrible and undemocratic. There's nothing to learn from them. Let's throw all of those experiences onto the trash bin of history and move on. But in fact, in every major socialist revolution and reconstruction that followed, there were massive campaigns to mobilize the spirit of the people, the spirit of the masses, to engage in socialist reconstruction, from the Stakhanovite experience in 1930s Soviet Union to Che Guevara and the 10 million ton Zafra campaign to China's Great Leap Forward, which, yes, was a great disaster. It didn't work out the way they wanted it to, but it mobilized the energies of the people. And all great moments of socialist reconstruction do that. That is a collective force, a material force that will be necessary if the socialist forces can gain power and defend it in some part of the world. That will require some version. It's an old-fashioned language. Okay, maybe we'll find better. But the new socialist man and woman, a new collective spirit to rebuild and reinvent and reimagine human possibility, and draw the balance sheets however we want about the socialist experience. But in all of those episodes, there was a tremendous outpouring of solidarity and collective enthusiasm that shouldn't just be dismissed.
Thank you for that answer. It was a fascinating exploration of political and social possibility. I'd like to bring that point to actually how we began discussion by talking about pessimism and blindness on generally ongoing movements of resistance and social action. And most of the same figures preaching climate doomism, with some exceptions, have little to say about the legacies or ongoing projects of ecological transformation or the legacies of actually existing socialism as well. So I guess I'd like to ask if there are any empirical and also historical examples you'd like to discuss about historic socialism or historic radical experiments. And such of these include the very mixed, but in my opinion, worth nuanced analysis of, say, the Chinese agrarian reform or Cuban agroecological experiments, or even Zimbabwe's land reform, which the Samoa tradition has brought to prominence. And also how, I guess, can we understand movements not understood as environmentally relevant, including popular slum movements in Brazil, India, and Indonesia, or the ongoing axis of resistance in Yemen, Palestine, and South Lebanon as similar projects of ecology and world making. So I guess, what lessons do you think environmentalists or ecologically minded figures who do not consider themselves environmentalists as a loaded term, what can people learn from these past examples of resistance that are otherwise completely disregarded in mainstream or even left-wing environmental discourse?
I think we can begin by recognizing that historically moments of dramatically unfavorable climate change, which looks different in different parts of the world, could be drought, could be extreme cold, etc. Moments of dramatically unfavorable climate change over the past 3,000 years have been moments of political possibility. They have been bad for ruling classes. This is true of the Bronze Age collapse, so-called. It's true of the crisis of the Roman West. After the crisis of the Roman West, which was partly political rot and economic rot from within, but also social revolt, as well as the great migration of peoples, peasants reorganized village life across Western and Central Europe. They lived better, healthier, more equitably, and in hierarchical but not class societies. So too, after the crisis of the 14th century, when Europe's producing classes defeated, but not overthrew, but defeated the ruling classes of Western and Central Europe, and there was a golden age in living standards for peasants and workers for 150 years. And as I mentioned, there is a history of climate change and political economic crisis, popular revolt running through the history of capitalism all the way up to the present. I think the question you posed is so rich, and I was trying to figure out how these two different moments that you flagged, one is the more diffuse, not in a critical way diffuse, but the diffuse and dispersed unrest in Brazil's favelas and in Gaza and many other places around the world with, up to recently in the case of the latter, with the experience of state socialism. I think much of the climate left has abandoned politics and abandoned a political imagination. Even when there is a political imagination that's offered, however, which is important, it tends to be delinked from history. So I think, for instance, of Andreas Malm and Jody Dean and Kai Heron invoking climate Leninism in one way or another, it's completely detached from the actual historical experience of Leninism. Andreas Malm explicitly rejects everything that happened after 1928. Oh, Stalin bad, and we're going to ignore it. Dean and Heron, who I appreciate a little bit more, ignore what seems to me the obvious point, that the genius of Lenin by the early 1920s was, having seen the defeat of the proletarian revolution in Germany and elsewhere, he grasped immediately that the Archimedean lever of socialist revolution would be the struggles in the Global South. It seems to me that there are useful insights there. It's not Lenin. The crucial contribution of Leninism is not the vanguard party. Many people had different conceptions of the vanguard party, and much of what is attributed to Lenin was not, in fact, Lenin's policy. And Lenin's own biography reveals him sometimes arguing against the party cadres and in favor of the rank and file, sometimes the other way around, all of this stuff. But the experience of state socialism tells us at least two things. And these are the two great accomplishments. These are related to the two great accomplishments of state socialism. One is that if you want to have a revolution, you have to defend it. And that's not pretty. That is ugly and brutal. So one of the world historical accomplishments of the Soviet project, of course, was the defeat of Nazi Germany. And Hitler was prepared to fight the last war. The famous quote when he's getting ready to invade the Soviet Union in the spring of 1941 is, "We kick in the front door and the whole decrepit structure will collapse." The whole point of Stalin's reconstruction was to build a state that would not collapse, and a military that would not collapse, and a food system that would not collapse. And they came close, but they didn't collapse. And that's a real accomplishment. Indeed, as I often say, one of the signal accomplishments and contributions to human and extra-human well-being in the 20th century was the destruction of Nazi Germany. So the two great accomplishments, one of them was be able to defend the revolution and build a state and military that can defend the revolution. And the other was to reconstruct after great wars. This is quite extraordinary. This latter point is quite extraordinary when we consider, for instance, that the Soviets, after the Second World War, built more housing for more people than any state in the history of humankind. And, were there lots of problems and errors? And, it was a brutal place, a brutal country, a poor country traumatized by 28 million dead. I remind Americans that the Americans lost about 450,000 some odd people in all of World War II. The Red Army lost 1 million men in the last 3 months of the war in the drive to Berlin, which the U.S. and its allies allowed the Germans to put all of its forces in the East to fight the Red Army, to exhaust the Red Army. So there's a history of, I think, a political imagination that needs to be taken seriously. And so much of today's, let's talk about revolutionary possibilities and utopias and transitions. And they simply want to pretend that the death squads, the invasions, the biological warfare. People forget the U.S. used biological warfare in Korea. This is not conspiracy theory. This is all on the up and up. So we want to get a sense of what practically needs to be done. Otherwise, you end up like the communards, whose revolution we just celebrated. The communards, the army comes in and kills them all. So this is, these are questions of political imagination, of state power, of the power to defend revolutionary and democratic gains. The history of the Global South, and after World War II especially, is basically, how do we avoid becoming Mossadegh or Sukarno? Or more recently, Gaddafi. I'm not saying Gaddafi was an angel, but the invasion and subsequent transformation of Libya is a war crime. And much of the left, especially the academic left, wants to have nothing to do with these conversations. They want to pretend the Green New Deal is going to come and save the world. And it's naive. It's magical thinking.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that kind of gets us to our next question about intellectuals, because you lay out this critique of intellectuals where they are at times tend to, and I'm quoting here, evade the dynamics of capital and class through tropes of colonialism, extractivism, plantational scene, and sometimes deceptively the West or Europe. And you continue by saying, and I'm quoting here again, if the approaches are diverse, the wider ideological impact of these tropes has been fairly uniform. In the main, these meta-categories in academic cultures, they sustain privilege the following: regional particularism, class and capital denialism, methodological nationalism and groupism, and a kind of new institutionalism that privileges a specific productive or political form, states, mines, plantations, etc., at the interpretive expense of their underlying relations, end quote. But you also ask, and I'm quoting here again, is it impolite to observe that such empiricism finds its historical taproot in the 17th century English empiricism, or that such empiricism was closely linked to the actually existing primitive accumulation, colonialism, and the slave trade? Probably, but I can see no way around the matter, end quote. But this, as you demonstrate, is in direct contradiction with the minority of scholars in the 1970s whose scholarship was
in the 70s, for a brief moment, it was permitted to talk about class and capital, socialism and capitalism, imperialism. We had great scholars, and some of them survived into the neoliberal era, and many were suppressed or decided that they would rather go along with the Western realignment of the intelligentsia to aid and explain away and enable neoliberal capitalism.
Right. And yeah, it just leads me to this question, because for one, I would love for you to elaborate on your critique of bourgeois reductionism, empiricism, or rather methodological groupism, which, as you state, sharply contrasts with the world historical method and its preference for dialectical emergence, consolidation, and movements of relational wholes, end quote. But also, I would love to, even because I know Casey also wanted to discuss this as well, how you see the role of the academic today especially for someone as yourself who is as established as you are?
Well, I'm established in the sense I'm very fortunate. I don't come out of the professional manager class. I come out of the working class.
Right.
I have tenure and a collective bargaining agreement. So let's hope that that's enough to keep me employed.
Right.
We should remember that academia is a very conservative institution. It is reproduced by the disciplines whose job is to discipline academics, to discipline intellectuals. The role of the knowledge factory is central to capital accumulation. We've known this since the 60s with Mario Savia's critique of Clark Kerr and others. Fulbright, the senator at the end of the 60s, and actually in 67, talked about a military industrial academic complex to highlight the central role of the universities in the war machine. Well, I'm reminded of what Noam Chomsky always said, that the more educated you are, the more indoctrinated you are. We find a lot of that in the academic world today. People know a lot about a specific thing, and they defend their tunnel vision as a virtue, the virtue of expertise, of good science, and all of that. And my view is that, of course, let 100 flowers bloom, but 100 flowers precisely are not permitted to bloom. And there are certain lines one should not cross, especially as a younger scholar. And younger scholars understand. So they often make many political concessions that then become permanent concessions. There are certain kinds of outrage that can be vented, but again, in line with the quotation from one of my essays on power, profit, and Promethianism, they can vent the outrage within a narrow sphere. And if you venture out of that, so for instance, today, if you want to talk about your outrage at settler colonialism, no problem. If you want to talk about how concrete settler colonial projects are about the accumulation of capital, cheap labor, advancing the rate of profit, then forget about it. You're a vulgar Marxist. Is there any other kind in today's academic world? I don't know. So as long as you don't raise questions about exploitation and you channel the professional managerial class's outrage around oppression in ways that are socially acceptable, then you're fine. So this is a moment where we should understand that at the very moment when even the capitalists need the most creative and dynamic solutions and the most creative and dynamic thinking, they are closing down that possibility. Now, Nature in a year ago, in January 2023, published a very interesting article talking about the sharp reduction in what they call disruptive research. They said, they reported on these authors whose name escapes me at the moment, but it's in January 2023. In Nature, you see the decline of so-called disruptive scientific research. And this shows the rot at the heart of capitalism's scientific apparatus. We've already seen how deeply corrupted it is in relation to, say, Big Pharma. And that's just a fact. But everywhere in terms of science and technology, the capacity to really reimagine and reinvent the world has diminished more and more and more. As David Graeber asked over a decade ago, where are all the flying cars? There are no flying cars. Most of the technologies that are celebrated as innovative, like the smartphone, are essentially smaller versions of technology that existed in the 1970s and that have been in the works since the 1940s. So we want to, I think, take very seriously the social basis of acceptable ideas, of acceptable Marxisms. And especially you see with Marxism, a complete and really, in my view, discouraging abandonment of historical interpretation in recent years. There used to be that the major debates within Marxism were over historical questions. And now it's over your opinion. and I don't like it. You sound like Latour, so you must be a Latourian. That kind of thing. You sound like this person, so that's who you must be. There's no interest in articulating our differences on historical terrain. So, like Josh, when you were asking me about Cedric Robinson, I wanted to be very clear. It's like, I'm not dismissing everything he's done. When we, so what does it actually mean if I say, there's a transhistoric dimension to his arguments? Well, let me show you my assessment historical. That doesn't mean I'm right. It doesn't mean that there aren't other interpretations. But once I give you that assessment, then we can have a meaningful debate. But most of the academic world and most Marxists are completely uninterested in these historical questions. And I just want to say to comrades, please come back to the heart of the matter, which is that the history in historical materialism is, a big deal and might actually be useful for what we're trying to do.
Absolutely. And I totally agree and appreciate that. Actually, I should let folks know where they can find you and how can they read your work and just whatever, any other projects you're working on that you want to, say promote out there, anything. Yeah.
I'm Jason W. Moore, and I teach world history at Binghamton University. If you like any of the things that I brought up in this conversation today, you can go to my website, jasonwmoore.com. I'm also easy to find on Twitter, academia.edu. You name it, you'll probably find me. Remember the W, and you will find me even more easily and not wind up with the right-wing evangelical Christian dude or the guy who directs pitch-perfect movies.